Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to discuss carbohydrates as a major component of food chemistry. At the end of the video, you should be able to define carbohydrates, give sources as well as classifications of carbohydrates. Welcome. Carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are organic compounds made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. In most cases, the hydrogen and oxygen atom in carbohydrates are always in the ratio 1 to 2. And whenever you have two hydrogen molecule and one oxygen molecule, then it forms a water molecule inside there. So we say that thing is hydrated. There is an hydrate. So in this carbohydrate also, we do have two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen. They are in the ratio 2 to 1. So it means there is hydrates in the component. There is hydrate. There is a presence of hydrate. Therefore, we say sometimes carbohydrates are called carbohydrates. And therefore, the names are derived from that hydrate component part of it. So carbohydrate can also be called saccharides. And saccharides means sugar. Whenever you see saccharides, it simply means sugar. And that's why we have things like monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides. What those means simply the number of sugar in that complex substance. So the key term here is a saccharide, which simply means sugar. So this sugar, there are some which are more complex and there are some which are very simple. So the most simple, the simplest form of carbohydrate, is glucose, which is also known as monosaccharides, because that is the simplest form. The single unit of sugar is a monosaccharides. So when you combine them, when you combine monosaccharides with another monosaccharide, we will have a complex substances which are now called polysaccharides. We are going to see that one later on in this video. So it is important to note that names of most carbohydrates, whenever you see the CHO in this video, it is just a short form of carbohydrate. So I've used this to refer to carbohydrates. So names of most carbohydrates are characterized by the ending of "-ose". They have names which end with "-ose". For example, glucose, lactose, maltose, fructose. So most of them have the name that ends with the word "-ose". It is also important to note that carbohydrates do occur in many plants and in animals and other organisms as well. In animals, the sugar, which is glucose, is the main carbohydrate that is present in animals, and it is stored in the form of glycogen. So in animals, sugar is present as glycogen. That is the storage form of sugar. The simplest sugar that is found in animal is glucose, and it is stored in form of glycogen. However, in plants, you will find that in plants they are stored in another form known as starch. So carbohydrates are stored as starch in plants, but stored as glycogen in animals. Some plants also have carbohydrates in another form known as cellulose, but this one is a structural polysaccharide. What do I mean when I say structural polysaccharide in plants? It means they form part of the structure of the plant. For example, in the cell wall, we do have cellulose in the cell wall. Cellulose, which is a polysaccharide, which is a carbohydrate. Then we have gum, which are also a polysaccharides, which can be obtained from plants, seaweeds, and organisms. Dear learners, from this introduction, it is important to note that carbohydrates are just organic sugar, and these sugar are also known as saccharides. Saccharides, which are just simply sugar, can be divided into simple saccharides and complex saccharides. The most simple saccharide is known as monosaccharides, which is the glucose. So glucose is the simplest sugar, which is a monosaccharide. Now when you move from a monosaccharide, you are heading towards a complex sugar such as disaccharide, trisaccharide, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides, as we are going to discuss later. It is also important to note from this introduction that in animals, glucose is stored as glycogen, or carbohydrate is stored in form of glycogen. In plants, however, carbohydrates are stored as starch. And in plants, they can also be in form of cellulose. So to understand all these concepts, let us discuss classifications of carbohydrates. Classification of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are classified into three major groups. We have digestible carbohydrates or available carbohydrates. These are energy producers. They are carbohydrates which can be digested by the enzymes or can be absorbed directly into the body. They include glucose, sucrose, lactose, and starch. Then we have another category which is digestible or unavailable carbohydrates, which include dietary fiber and orophages. These are carbohydrates which cannot be digested in the body by the enzyme or which cannot be absorbed by the body directly. They are just called refuges. Their role is just to add bulk to the food and to prevent constipation. An example is cellulose. Then in the last category we have hydrolysis based. Hydrolysis is the process by which carbohydrate is being broken down into simple ones, chemically broken down into simple form. So based on hydrolysis, whether they can be broken down or not broken down, we have the following carbohydrates based on hydrolysis. We have monosaccharides, we have disaccharides, we have trisaccharides, and we have polysaccharides. Now let us discuss the four that have been mentioned. Monosaccharides. Monosaccharides, these are simple sugar, as I've mentioned up there. They cannot be hydrolyzed into simpler form because already they are very simple. They serve as building blocks for complex sugar. So when you want to get a complex sugar, you must have a monosaccharide so that you add several monosaccharides to form a complex sugar which are polysaccharides in nature. So, for example, if you want a disaccharide, you add 2 molecules of monosaccharides, and 1 molecule of a monosaccharide is normally called monomer. So you add 2 monomers of monosaccharides to get a disaccharide through a process known as condensation. So, in a simple term, they serve as building blocks for complex sugar such as polysaccharides. Then they are classified according to carbon atoms in their molecules. What do I mean? I mean monosaccharides can also be put into classes. You can again classify them. And what is the basis of classification? When you are classifying monosaccharides, you use the number of carbon atoms that they have. For example, if it has 3 carbon atoms, then we call them trioses. If it has 4 carbon atoms, then it's called tetroses. If it has 5 carbon atoms, they are called pentoses. And when they have 6 carbon atoms, they are called hexoses. So these are the classes of monosaccharides. So the simplest class of monosaccharides is trioses, which has got 3 carbon atoms. And the example of monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Those are examples. So don't confuse between classes of monosaccharides and example of monosaccharide. Classes include trioses, tetroses, pentoses, and hexoses. And this classification is based on the number of carbon atoms that they contain. The general formula for carbohydrate is CH20 in bracket N, where N is the number of carbon atoms, and the most common one are the ones with 5 and 6 carbon atom. Dear learners, before we can proceed, I would like to emphasize on the following. When you are classifying carbohydrates, first of all, there are three major groups: digestible carbohydrates or available carbohydrates. That is the first group. The second group is indigestible carbohydrates or unavailable carbohydrates. And the third group is hydrolysis based, those carbohydrates that can be hydrolyzed. And in this hydrolysis based, we've mentioned monosaccharides, disaccharides, trisaccharides, polysaccharides as major examples. Under monosaccharides, I've said they are the simplest form of carbohydrates, and they can never be hydrolyzed or broken down into other simplest form. And I've said that monosaccharides can also be put in other classes, and these classes are based on the number of carbon atoms that they have. If a monosaccharide has 3 carbon atoms, then it belongs to a class known as trioses. If it has 4 carbon atoms, then that monosaccharide belongs to a class known as tetrases. If it has got 5 carbon atoms, then that is a pentases. If it has 6, then that is oxases. So those are the classes of monosaccharides. However, there's also a way in which you can classify monosaccharides. I don't mean carbohydrate, but I'm now talking about monosaccharides. Monosaccharide can be classified based on the number of carbon atoms they have. We place them into trioses, tetrases, pentases, and oxases. But again, depending on the functional group, carbohydrates can also be put into 2 major classes, and I would like to explain. Let us explain them. To begin with, it is important also to note that these monosaccharides, they may have hydroxyl group, a branch of OH in their structure, and sometimes they can also have a carboxyl oxygen in their structure, the CO in their structure. So the position of this carboxyl oxygen is what can be used again to place these monosaccharides into another class. And when you use carboxyl oxygen, this carboxyl oxygen is what is known as functional group. So based on the functional group, we can have monosaccharides being placed into 2 other different classes. We've placed them into the previous classes based on the number of carbon atoms, as have been discussed. In this category, we can also classify monosaccharides based on the functional group that they have. And in this case, based on carboxyl oxygen, CO. Based on the position of this carboxyl oxygen, we may have 2 other classes of monosaccharides. We may have aldoses and we may have ketoses. What is the difference between aldoses and ketoses as 2 other classes of monosaccharides? Aldoses are monosaccharides with carboxyl group attached to the far end of the structure at the terminal part of the sugar. So when the carboxyl group is attached to the terminal end of the monosaccharide, then we say it is a aldoses group. It is in the class known as aldoses. And an example is glucose. If the carboxyl sugar is attached at any other part apart from the far end, in any other position of the monosaccharide, then we say it is a ketoses. So what is the difference between aldoses and ketoses? In adult cells, the carboxyl group is present at the terminal of the sugar, while in keto cells, the carboxyl group is present at any other part of the sugar apart from terminal end. Having said that, we can now conclude that monosaccharides can be classified based on two aspects: the number of carbon atoms that they have, which group them into the category that I've mentioned, and also can be based on the functional group that they have, which group them into adult cells and also into keto cells. Now, as a summary, we can now summarize by saying that monosaccharides have one sugar. Monosaccharide is equal to one sugar, and they are the simplest form of sugar. Example are glucose, fructose, and even lactose. Then we have disaccharides is equal to two sugars, as I've said. When you add two monosaccharides, you get a disaccharides. So through a process known as condensation, as I've said. And this one, example are fructose, maltose, and lactose. So in the monosaccharides example, we have glucose and fructose. When you come to disaccharides, we have things like sucrose, maltose, and lactose. Then there's also another important thing to note here: oligosaccharides. Oligosaccharides is a carbohydrate with two or more sugars or two more monosaccharides in it. However, these sugars are joined together with a bond known as O-glycosidic bond. So the only thing that is new here is that in oligosaccharides, there's a bond known as O-glycosidic bond. Otherwise, it has got two or more monosaccharides or sugars joined together to form it. It is also a form of a polysaccharide, but now it is specific that it has a certain bond known as O-glycosidic bond, giving it the name oligosaccharide. Example can be sucrose, maltose, and lactose. Then finally, we have polysaccharides, and in polysaccharide there must be many sugar. In some cases, up to 100 sugars make a polysaccharides. So they are made up of several sugars. So several monomers of monosaccharides are being joined together to form a polysaccharides. And this is a very complex carbohydrate, complex sugar. And example is starch and cellulose. Now, we need to discuss sources of carbohydrates and examples of carbohydrates. Generally, apart from glycogen and lactose, carbohydrates are normally from plant origins, and mostly they are from fruits, vegetables, and cereals. The only carbohydrate from plant origin are glycogen and lactose, which are normally present in milk. Otherwise, we can generally say that some of the examples of carbohydrates are things like sugar, bread, pastries, plants, potato, and whole grains. Thank you. Dear learners, we've come to an end of this video, and in this video, I will define carbohydrates as organic sugar, which are also known as saccharides. We will also look at classifications of carbohydrates, which include digestible carbohydrates, indigestible carbohydrates, and carbohydrates which are based on hydrolysis factor. And we will also discuss monosaccharides, and in the discussion of monosaccharides, we've given the classes of monosaccharides based on the number of carbon that it has. For example, if it has 3 carbon atoms, then it is trioses. Then we've also seen another class as tetroses, pentoses, and hexoses. Then we've also seen that monosaccharides can also be classified based on the functional group that it has. Therefore, we have 2 classes in that class, in that basis, which include aldoses and ketoses. In this video again, learners, we've seen the sources and some of the example of carbohydrates. In our next video, I'm going to discuss major properties of carbohydrates and the uses of carbohydrates. Thank you very much.